So, right, we'll be moving on to Ryan Cross, who's asking, can you give some advice on how to start getting gigs?
Yes. Okay, so Ryan, depending on, this is a question that does come up quite a lot. I'm in a new band, how do I start getting gigs? Or, I'm a singer-songwriter, how do I start getting gigs? I think one thing that's really, really important that bands aren't doing is putting the work into their local area. And also putting work into the momentum that allows them to go and do gigs. So last week we talked a lot about how to find musicians and how momentum can carry you into finding musicians. Like, for example, I would never in a million years struggle to find musicians. That isn't something I'd worry about, because I feel like my momentum, the social media stuff, my experience, my leadership side of it will always allow me to attract musicians. And I think it's the same thing when you're trying to find gigs. Before you try to find gigs, I would start looking at your social media and what is online. If you haven't got a decent online digital presence, then you don't really exist. So I think it's really, really important that firstly, before you start looking at getting gigs, you look at what social media you've got and how it will work when you show other people. So if you're going to find a promoter, which we'll get to in a second, if you're going to find other bands, if you're going to find other artists, if you're going to go to open mic nights or approach open mic nights, what can you show them with that proof? This whole channel, this whole show, and this whole idea of breaking into music industry as such is all about proof. What are you proving? So when you say to someone, give us a gig, and this goes along starting to get gigs all the way through. Promoters, because it's a business, promoters need to get people to gigs. So therefore it is a business. You have to have that kind of approach of, yes, it's about the music, but more importantly, if a promoter puts you on and you can't get anyone to that gig, then that promoter is putting a lot of time and effort and money out of their life into doing something for no reason whatsoever, just for the love of the music. So with that in mind, if you want to get gigs, the best way you can do that is by proving that you can bring people down to a gig. And the best way you can prove anything is by showing people your social media and saying, look at the engagement I get. I have put a question saying, if I get a gig in Brighton, who's going to come down? And 30 people have said, yes, we will definitely come down. You show that to a promoter and the promoter will say, 30 people, that's a decent start for an opening act. So before you start looking at approaching people to get gigs, I would look at what you've got social media wise that can prove that you can bring people down to your gigs. Now, when it comes to actually getting the gigs of who you approach, there's a couple of people. Number one, other bands. If you can approach other bands and say, look, we're just starting out, you've been going a little bit longer, give us some ideas of who we can get in touch with. Bands themselves will put on gigs. So what you could do, and what I would do to start with, is go to a band and say, look, when you go and do your next gig, you might have 2 or 3 bands. Let's do a 5 or 10 minute slot. Let's do 2 or 3 songs just to warm up the crowd. We'll bring an extra 20 people, 15, 20 people. And that way you've got a bigger audience, and all we're going to do is take up 15 minutes of your time. Now you can do the same thing when it comes to promoters. If you want to find high-end promoters, the first thing I would look for is Twitter, and I would look at LinkedIn. And the reason for those is because they are great search engines, as opposed to YouTube and Facebook, because it's harder to find stuff like that. I think Twitter has got a much stronger search capability, and so has LinkedIn. Now, when it comes to finding promoters, it's the same thing. You're approaching them and saying, give us a gig, let me have a go. And you'll find as well that there are in cities there are promoters, but there are also venues who put on their own gigs. Some venues don't use promoters, they just say, we've got an in-house team, we'll just do it ourselves. So if you're not sure in your town, in your city, then approach the venues that you found that do bands, do the research, and go to the venue and just say, we'd love to come and play a gig. Who do we talk to? Who do we have to send our music to? And who do we have to email? And that's what the venue's there for. The venue is there to get musicians or get bands in and get bums on seats. So they're going to want to help you out. They're going to want to at least tell you who to talk to, and whether that's someone in-house or a promoter. But I would start, if it's very, very basic, right at the beginning, I would start with going and finding other bands in the area and just saying, can you help me, please? Because bands want to help each other normally when they're asked. And go and ask a band in that area and say, have you got any contacts that we could talk to about getting a gig, or could we come and open for your band and just do 5 to 10 minutes? Now, it's very, very important that you don't ask to do it just to have a 30 or 40 minute slot. Just before this, we were talking about a band that, when was it, this week, or not so long ago, that I was offered a 20-minute slot and ended up doing 50 minutes, and all the rest of the bands got pissed off. So another band won't mind you coming and bringing 10, 20 people for the sake of 10 minutes. So go in small, baby steps, build it up piece by piece. Patience is so much of these questions. Take it right from the bottom, and every day you're building it up, the 1%, the 1%. Get your 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 gigs in your area, just doing 3 songs and just saying, don't worry, we'll go on first, because it won't be long before you go from the first slot to the second slot to the third slot, and should you want to, into the headline slot, and then from there into your own tours and everything else. So you have to start at the bottom and work up. But the way you do it is you have to get into your local community and find out who's putting on the gigs and who's doing those gigs, and hang around with those people.
So what were you saying about building your social media presence before you go and approach those promoters? What would you advise to young bands starting out who are perhaps quite new to social media and can't necessarily get the engagement yet, having not done many gigs? How would you advise that they get that engagement before approaching promoters?
And so one of the things that we haven't talked about here, which is a part of that, is what happens if you're too young to actually go to get gigs. If you are, while the audience, traditionally my audience tends to be sort of 20s and 30s, I know that there's guys watching this, or people watching this, that are 15, 16 that are going to struggle to get into a club to do a gig. And so therefore you have to be a problem solver, and you have to start looking at where you can play and being entrepreneurial and actually putting on the gig yourself. So in that instance, if I was coming up with blanks and I couldn't get a gig myself, but I knew that I could get my friends down to a gig, then I'd be looking at school halls, I'd be looking at community centres, I'd be looking at even outside gigs where I could find some electricity. I'd be looking at doing a gig in a garage. I'd be looking at going to people's houses and saying, who's got a place that we can have a big house party, or has got some people might live in a place where they might have a barn, or they have a friend who's got a barn. So it's a creativity in saying, if we can't get a gig in a club or in a venue, then we'll take a step even further back and we'll put on our own gig. And we will then take footage of that gig, because we're going to get all our friends there. And the thing is, if you can't get, on your very first gig, if you can't get 10 of your mates there, then you've got a problem. Because we're talking your mates on your first gig. You should be able to get them down. But, get a bunch of mates into a venue where you can just play and make noise. It can be in a rehearsal room. You can book rehearsal rooms for, 10, 15 quid an hour. And you can book out a nice sized rehearsal room, bring your mates down and put on your own gig there. And the key is you record it, you video it, you get loads of content, which then can go on your social media. And again, builds that proof, builds that momentum. So then when you do go to show the next level of promoter or bands, they will take you more seriously.
Yeah, and you could do that even if you're not underage necessarily.
Absolutely.
Just if you're struggling to get gigs, that would work quite well.